Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our last chapter of the term. We're going to be covering chapter 14 in this last set of mini lessons. So chapter 14 covers disease and epidemiology. So kind of the progression of disease, how bacteria cause disease, and the study of the spread of disease, which is what we call epidemiology. This first mini video is going to be covering the ideas of symbioses, the different types of relationships that microbes have, and then taking a look at normal microbiota and how sometimes those can actually cause disease. So the first topic is symbioses, symbiotic relationships. We mentioned this briefly back in chapter 6, kind of around the Bonnie Basler video when we were talking about quorum sensing and antagonistic and synergistic relationships. So symbiotic relationships are ones where the organisms are so tightly interrelated that they typically cannot live independently of each other. So there's a few types of symbiotic relationships that we have in the book and in the notes. So the first one is probably the most common type of symbiotic relationship, or the most easily observed, is what we call mutualism. So mutualism is you have two organisms living so closely together, and in that close relationship, each organism benefits from being in that relationship. So my little root nodules over here, these pictures here, those are representing the rhizobium. So if you remember, we talked about rhizobium in our survey of bacteria in chapter 11, where these are the nitrogen fixers. So they help take nitrogen gas from the atmosphere, convert it into usable forms of nitrogen like nitrates, nitrites, and ammonias, and then the plants utilize that, incorporate in their tissues, and then that progresses through this nitrogen cycle and into the food chain. So what's the payoff? So what's the mutualistic benefit for the plants and the microbes? Well, in these little nodules, you can see here, these little bumps all over the roots, those little nodules are the houses that the plant builds for the bacteria. So it's actually plant structure that within these little nodules, the bacteria live. So that's the benefit. The bacteria get a nice, cozy little place to live, and the plant can provide food, right? Because up here, the plant is doing photosynthesis, making sugar. It can bring it down into the roots and basically give the bacteria a place to live and basically room and board, right? So it's getting food and it's getting somewhere to live. Then the plant benefits by getting that nitrogen, so it has good growth. If you were to strip a bacteria, or sorry, strip the plant away from bacteria or plant a seedling in sterile soil with no bacteria, it grows much poorer than those who have this beneficial relationship. So there's clear evidence to show that the plants benefit by making a relationship with these bacteria. So that is our example of mutualism. I'm going to skip over commensalism and amensalism, and I'm going to move to parasitism, because that's the other one that's really easily identifiable and studied. So parasitism is where two organisms are interrelated, where one is benefiting and one is harmed, and that relationship is usually pretty obvious. So for example, I have intracellular parasites. So these things here inside white blood cells are not supposed to be there. Those are intracellular parasites. And then these pictures here are of bacterial plaque, the biofilm that grows on our surface of our teeth. That is a parasitic relationship. The benefit of the bacteria living in these locations, either inside the white blood cells or on the surface of our teeth, is they benefit from typically stripping nutrients away from that environment. So they are using the sugar in our mouth, they are using the nutrients inside the white blood cells and harvesting, if you will, or benefiting from that nutrition source. The negative impact for the host in this case is for the white blood cells. They typically are destroyed. For our teeth, these bacteria, when they metabolize the sugars that are in our mouth, they secrete acids, and that can cause tooth decay. So we are negatively impacted by these organisms. So mutualism and parasitism are probably the easiest ones to kind of recognize those relationships. Commensalism and amensalism are a little bit harder to find good examples of these. Commensalism is the idea where two organisms are in a relationship where one benefits and the other is neither helped nor harmed. So it's like just a freeloader, so something that's riding along for the ride. It benefits, but the other organism could care less. It has no impact on that. And that one's hard to identify good examples because typically if you look close enough, you can see that where one organism is benefiting, the other one is either benefiting or is harmed in some way. So if you look close at some commensal relationships, they truly are more a mutualistic or a parasitic relationship. And then amensalism is kind of the opposite of commensalism, where one organism is harmed while the other is neither helped nor harmed. So that's somewhat of a new symbiotic relationship that they've identified. So you have one that by the presence of one organism living in that relationship, one is harmed, but the other is neither helped nor harmed. But again, if you look close enough, that might be more like a parasitic relationship. It's really hard to find these symbiotic relationships where one partner is not affected in either way. So those are our discussions of symbiotic relationships. So why is that important in our discussion of normal microbiota? Well, we are in symbiotic relationships with bacteria all over in our bodies. Most of our bacterial relationships are mutualistic. We both benefit, we as in the human and the bacteria, benefit from having these relationships with the bacteria. And obviously, a few of our relationships are parasitic, in which the bacteria are living in us or on us and cause harm to our bodies. But the vast majority of bacteria in our bodies or on our bodies are benefiting us, and we are benefiting them. So that brings us to our discussion of normal microbiota. And so I just threw some pictures up here of some bacteria that typically are found on our bodies or in our bodies. So we have a couple different types or categories of normal microbiota. We have resident and transient. So transient microbiota are organisms that live on our bodies or in our bodies for short periods of time, maybe an hour or a day or a week, but they're not long-term residents, whereas obviously resident microbiota are. So we acquire them when we're young and we keep them through our entire life, and they are part of our being. We get our first microbiota at delivery and shortly after birth. So we are sterile in the womb. So there's no, I mean, with a few exceptions of pathogens that can actually cross the placenta. But amniotic fluid is sterile, sterile meaning no bacteria. And in that gestation space, we are sterile. We have no bacteria in our guts, on our skin, in our respiratory paths, in our reproductive paths. We don't have any bacteria. We're clean. During vaginal delivery, as the baby moves through the birth canal, the surface, the skin microbiota can be picked up from the mom's normal skin bacteria. The baby is swallowing some of the mucus and the fluids and stuff as the baby progresses through the birth canal. When baby first breastfeeds and latches on, she's swallowing the breast milk, and so that can also inoculate, if you will, the digestive tract. So coming into contact with mom's bacteria is how baby gets their first normal microbiota. And then what does everybody do with new baby? Daddy gets to hold the baby, siblings get to hold the baby, doctors get to hold the baby, nurses get to hold the baby goes into a bed or with a blanket and a hat. All of those things are not sterile. So the baby is coming into contact with these environmental bacteria and they become a part of their resident microbiota. And thus you begin your lifelong mutualistic relationship with your normal microbiota. And it's good because they do good things for you. In our intestinal tract, they generate a lot of our vitamins that we cannot make on our own. They outcompete pathogens. On our skin, they provide almost like an invisible barrier to prevent pathogens from coming in and landing on our skin. So love your bacteria. They're really good for you. Now, so here's just a table from your book. Again, you don't need to memorize it, but it's just kind of cool to see some of the things where they live, some of the genus that are found in these different body areas, and some of the notes you can read about some of their characteristics. So for example, in your lower digestive tract, like your large intestine, E. coli, which we use in lab, the bacteria are mostly strict anaerobes, though some are facultative anaerobes, and they're also resident microbiota. So we have to have oxygen for our metabolism in all of our cells, but inside the lumen of our large intestine, there's not a lot of oxygen there. It's just the digestion of food. And in our large intestine, most of our nutrients have already been absorbed. And so we have left is these bacteria kind of breaking down what's left over, producing their vitamins and some of their waste products. And so they live in an anaerobic environment or a low oxygen environment. Now, with these microbes that are living on our surfaces and inside of our bodies, sometimes they can actually cause some problems. And this is what we call opportunistic infections. So in the notes here, there are 3 ways where normal microbiota can become opportunistic infections. They can become pathogenic, even though in normal situations they aren't. So the first one is if you have immune suppression for some reason, either you are fighting another disease, you are taking immunosuppressive drugs, maybe bone marrow cancer, some kind of issue with your immune system. So those, when your immune system is suppressed, sometimes your normal microbiota can kind of switch sides and become more of a pathogen instead of a mutualistic symbiont. The next way that normal microbiota can become opportunistic pathogens is when there's a change in your normal microbiota, allowing some of the critters that already live there to become pathogens. So this might be taking long-term antibiotics can wipe out some of your normal microbiota, letting a few of the ones that are normally held in check to actually become more successful with less competition. So that might lead to yeast infections or urinary tract infections or sinus infections or Clostridium difficile infections, because you've changed the balance of your normal microbiota, allowing these other smaller kind of bad guys that hang out in the dark corners to actually take a foothold and become pathogenic. And then the last is introduction of a normal microbiota into a place where it's not supposed to be. So probably the most common example of that is urinary tract infection with fecal bacteria. So those exit points are pretty close, especially in females, from the rectum to the external urethral orifice. So if some of those fecal bacteria make their way into the urinary tract, E. coli does not belong in your urethra. But if it gets there, it can cause an infection. So, or fecal bacteria pretty much anywhere that's not in your large intestine can cause an infection. And so that's an example of a third way that your normal microbiota can cause infection. And I'm looking at, in my notes, I think I have one, did they add this? Yes, and this is pretty applicable to our times right now going on in the world. Stressful conditions, so just being under high levels of stress can change that's part of immune suppression, would be kind of connecting that, or your stressful situation can affect your normal homeostasis of your normal microbiota. So we have immune suppression, changes in normal microbiota, introduction of a normal microbiota into a non-normal location, and stressful conditions. All right, so that is it for our introduction, our first mini lesson for chapter 14. Our next topic is going to be reservoirs of infectious disease and movements of microbes into the body. All right, so I will see you next time. Bye.